The moment the tow truck driver saw the VIN number on my Jeep, his face changed so fast, it looked like someone had pulled the blood straight out of him. The sound that woke me up wasn't the engine. It was the chain. Thick steel links grinding against metal somewhere outside my bedroom window at 5:17 in the morning. I sat up instantly. My house was still dark except for the blue glow of the digital clock beside my bed, and for half a second I honestly thought somebody was stealing the Jeep. Then I heard a woman laughing outside. Loud, confident, satisfied. I already knew who it was before my feet hit the hardwood floor. I pulled on yesterday's jeans and stepped outside barefoot into the cold Arizona morning. The concrete still held onto the night air, and the smell of diesel exhaust drifted across the driveway like smoke. My black Jeep Wrangler sat halfway tilted onto the tow ramp while yellow hazard lights flashed across the quiet cul-de-sac. And standing there in a white fleece jacket with a clipboard tucked under one arm was Deborah Whitmore, president of the Copper Ridge HOA. She looked way too happy for 5 in the morning. Perfect timing, she said the second she saw me. Maybe now you'll finally learn the rules of this neighborhood. The tow truck driver didn't say anything. He kept tightening the chain beneath the Jeep while avoiding eye contact with me. Smart man. Deborah stepped closer like she was hosting a TV show. This vehicle has accumulated multiple violations, she announced loudly, making sure the neighbors peeking through blinds could hear every word. Unregistered commercial markings, unauthorized overnight parking, and failure to comply with HOA notices. I looked at the stack of papers in her hand. Most of them were warnings she'd taped to my front door over the past 2 months. One because my garage was open too long. One because my trash can stayed visible after pickup day. One because she claimed my Jeep made the neighborhood look hostile. I stared past her at the Jeep. Dust from the desert still coated the doors from my last assignment outside Tucson. There was a small, faded government parking decal low on the windshield near the driver's side corner. Most people never noticed it. Deborah noticed everything. "Ma'am," the tow truck driver muttered carefully. "You sure about this?" Deborah snapped her head toward him. "Absolutely. The HOA has full authority here." I almost smiled at that. Full authority. People like Deborah loved saying those words. They collected authority like trophies because deep down they were terrified of ever losing control. I walked closer to the Jeep, hearing the chain creak tighter underneath the frame. The driver finally looked at me. There was nervousness in his eyes now. Not fear yet. Just uncertainty. "Sir," he said quietly, "if there's a problem with the paperwork, now's probably the time." I glanced at the VIN plate near the windshield, then back at him. "There's definitely a problem," I said calmly. Deborah folded her arms. "Oh, please. Don't start threatening people because you got caught breaking community rules." I looked directly at her. "I'm not threatening anybody," I said. "I'm warning you." For 1 second, the entire driveway went quiet except for the idle rumble of the tow truck engine. Then the Jeep made a soft electronic beep from somewhere inside the dashboard. The driver froze. And that was the exact moment his expression changed. The tow truck driver slowly released the control lever and stared at the dashboard of my Jeep like it had just spoken to him. The soft electronic tone faded into silence, but something about it clearly bothered him. Deborah, meanwhile, looked irritated more than concerned. She hated interruptions, especially ones she did not understand. "What now?" she snapped, shifting the clipboard against her chest. The driver swallowed hard and climbed down from the truck. "Nothing," he muttered. "Probably aftermarket electronics." But he did not sound convinced. I could tell because his eyes kept drifting back toward the windshield decal. That tiny faded sticker had been there for almost 3 years, and until now nobody in Copper Ridge had paid attention to it except Deborah Whitmore. That woman noticed everything. If somebody painted their shutters the wrong shade of beige, she noticed. If a package sat on a porch longer than 6 hours, she noticed. If somebody parked a pickup truck in the driveway overnight instead of inside the garage, she treated it like a federal crime. And for some reason, from the moment I moved into the neighborhood 8 months earlier, she decided I was her favorite target. Maybe it was because I kept to myself. Maybe it was because I worked strange hours and disappeared for days at a time. Or maybe it was the Jeep itself. Copper Ridge was full of polished SUVs and luxury sedans that never touched dirt a day in their lives. Then there was mine. Matte black, dust-covered, steel bumper, 35-inch off-road tires. The thing looked like it belonged in the desert instead of a gated suburban neighborhood with artificial ponds and identical mailboxes. Deborah hated that Jeep before she ever hated me. The first time she knocked on my door, she brought over a plate of cookies and a printed copy of the HOA handbook. She smiled the entire time. She explained that community harmony depended on everybody respecting the visual standards of the neighborhood. 3 days later, she fined me because the Jeep had mud on the wheel wells. After that came the violation notices. One because my garage door stayed open while I organized tools. Another because she claimed the vehicle had unauthorized markings. She even cited me for intimidating vehicle presentation, which I did not realize was apparently a real thing until I saw it typed on official HOA letterhead. I never argued with her. That probably made her angrier. Deborah thrived on reactions. She wanted confrontations she could win in front of an audience. And Copper Ridge always gave her one. By now half the neighborhood was awake. Porch lights flickered on up and down the cul-de-sac, while people watched from windows holding coffee mugs like they were settling in for morning television. I recognized most of them. The retired dentist across the street, the couple with the golden retriever, the guy who always complained about trash pickup delays during HOA meetings. None of them knew anything about me beyond the rumors Deborah fed them. Ex-military, survivalist, government contractor, maybe dangerous. People invent stories. When somebody stays quiet too long, the truth was simpler. I liked privacy, but privacy makes certain people uncomfortable because they cannot control what they do not understand. The tow truck driver walked around the Jeep again and wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold morning air. "Sir," he said carefully, lowering his voice, "I need to ask directly. Is this vehicle attached to any government registration?" Deborah laughed immediately. "Oh, for God's sake, Frank, it is a Jeep, not a missile launcher." But Frank did not laugh with her. His eyes stayed locked on me. I slid my hands into my pockets and looked at the chain still hooked under the front axle. "You already scanned the VIN," I said quietly. "So you tell me." Frank looked back toward the tow truck like he was reconsidering every decision that had brought him into Copper Ridge that morning. The yellow lights reflected across the Jeep's hood in slow pulses while the diesel engine rattled softly in the cold air. Deborah let out an impatient sigh loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Are we seriously pretending this man is some kind of secret government agent now?" Nobody answered her. That was the first thing I noticed. 10 minutes earlier, she had complete control of the driveway. Now, even the people watching from their porches seemed unsure which side of the situation they were supposed to be on. Frank reached into the cab of the tow truck and grabbed a handheld scanner attached to a coiled cord. He looked down at the screen again, then back at the VIN plate near the windshield. "Sir," he said carefully, "this registration is locked." Deborah rolled her eyes. "What does that even mean?" Frank hesitated before answering. "It means I cannot fully access it through the state system." "So," she snapped, "run it again." I already did. The morning wind moved through the palm trees lining the street, carrying the faint smell of wet grass from the sprinkler systems starting up across the neighborhood. Somewhere down the block, a garage door opened. More people were waking up now. More witnesses. Deborah loved an audience when she thought she was winning. She stepped closer to me, lowering her voice just enough to sound threatening instead of dramatic. "You know what your problem is, Ethan," she said. "You think the rules do not apply to you." I stared at her without answering. The truth was, people like Deborah always confused silence with weakness. She thought because I did not argue during HOA meetings or fight her violation notices that I was intimidated by her. But after enough years working around real authority, you stop reacting to fake authority completely. "You disappear for days," she continued. "Nobody knows what you actually do. Your vehicle has strange markings. You come home at all hours of the night. Frankly, several residents have expressed concerns." I almost laughed at that. Residents. Deborah meant herself. Copper Ridge had become her private kingdom the second they handed her a clipboard and a title. She controlled mailbox colors, lawn height, holiday decorations, and parking rules like they were matters of national security. And the craziest part was that most people just accepted it because arguing with her sounded exhausting. Frank suddenly cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I really think maybe we should stop until this gets verified." Deborah spun toward him immediately. "No, absolutely not." She pointed at the Jeep like it personally offended her. "That vehicle has violated HOA policy for months. You already hooked it. Finish the job." Frank did not move. I could see sweat forming near his hairline despite the cool morning temperature. Then his radio crackled inside the tow truck cab. A voice came through low and distorted. "Frank, you still at the pickup site?" Frank grabbed the radio instantly. "Yeah." Static hissed through the speaker. "Dispatch says stop the tow immediately and confirm the VIN again." Deborah threw both hands into the air. "Oh, come on." But Frank was no longer listening to her. He slowly read the VIN number into the radio while every person on the street stood completely still. I watched his expression change with every digit. His jaw tightened. His shoulders stiffened. Then the radio went silent for 3 long seconds before the dispatcher came back on. This time the voice sounded nervous. "Frank," the dispatcher said carefully, "unhook the vehicle and step away from it now." The entire street went dead quiet after that sentence came through the radio. Even the sprinklers ticking across the lawns suddenly sounded louder. Frank stared at the speaker in his hand like he wanted the voice to repeat itself differently the second time. It did not. "Frank," dispatch said again, slower now. "Remove the chains immediately. Do not transport the vehicle. Supervisor is already reviewing the file." Deborah stepped forward before he could answer. "Absolutely not," she snapped. "This removal was authorized by the Homeowners Association." Frank ignored her completely. That was new. 5 minutes ago, he jumped every time she raised her voice. Now he crouched beside the Jeep and started loosening the steel hooks with shaking hands. The chains clanged against the pavement as he released tension from the tow lift. Deborah looked around at the neighbors watching from their driveways, realizing control of the scene was slipping away from her inch by inch. "This is unbelievable," she said loudly. "You people are acting like this vehicle belongs to the President of the United States." I stayed quiet. That bothered her even more. Deborah needed emotional reactions the same way some people need caffeine in the morning. She fed off arguments. Silence starved her. Frank finally stood up and wiped grease onto his jeans. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I really think you should contact your legal department before going further with this." Deborah laughed sharply. "Our legal department?" she repeated. "Frank, this is an HOA neighborhood, not Washington, D.C." He looked like he wanted to leave immediately, but was too nervous to move too fast. His eyes kept drifting back toward the Jeep's windshield decal. It was barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. Faded blue lettering. Tiny identification code. Nothing dramatic. Most people would assume it was an old parking permit. But certain databases recognized it instantly. And apparently, so did somebody at dispatch. One of the neighbors across the street slowly stepped farther onto his driveway, holding his coffee mug. "Deborah," he called cautiously, "maybe you should let this go." She turned toward him so fast her blonde hair whipped across her shoulder. "Excuse me. I am just saying maybe there is more going on here than we thought." "No," she snapped. "What is going on here is that one resident thinks he is above community standards." Then she pointed directly at me again. "Do you know how many complaints I have received about this vehicle?" I honestly did not care. But Deborah had spent months building this narrative around me. The strange, quiet neighbor with the intimidating Jeep. The man nobody understood. She wanted the entire neighborhood to believe she was protecting them from something. That was the funny thing about power in places like Cedar Ridge. Most of it came from fear wrapped in polite language. "You have unauthorized modifications on that vehicle," she continued. "Blackout panels. Reinforced bumper. Non-standard equipment." I glanced toward the roof rack, where desert dust still sat packed into the corners from my last trip south. She was not wrong. The Jeep was modified, just not for the reasons she imagined. Frank climbed back into the tow truck, but did not start driving away. Instead, he picked up his phone and stepped out again almost immediately. His face had gone pale. "Sir," he said quietly to me, "dispatch wants to know if there is anybody they need to contact before they close the call." Deborah threw both hands up again. "Close the call? Nobody is closing anything." Then she pulled out her own phone. "Fine. If nobody else here wants to enforce the rules, I will call the police myself." I looked at her for the first time in almost a minute. "That would be a mistake," I said calmly. But she was already dialing. Deborah held the phone against her ear with the kind of confidence people only have when they believe the entire system exists to protect them. The morning sun was finally starting to rise above the rooftops, throwing pale orange light across the cul-de-sac, while the tow truck hazard lights blinked slower now against the fading darkness. Frank stood beside his truck, looking trapped between panic and regret. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Deborah paced near the edge of my driveway while the call connected. Yes, hello, she said sharply. This is Deborah Whitmore, president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. We need an officer here immediately. She glanced toward me like she expected that sentence alone to scare me. We have an uncooperative resident and a suspicious vehicle situation. Several neighbors exchanged nervous looks after hearing the word suspicious. That was deliberate. Deborah loved using language that sounded official enough to create fear without technically accusing anybody of anything. No, she continued into the phone. The tow company is refusing to complete the authorized removal. Her voice grew louder with every sentence. Yes, I would appreciate immediate assistance. She ended the call and folded her arms triumphantly. There, she announced. Now maybe we can get competent people involved. Frank let out a quiet breath through his nose and looked away. He wanted no part of whatever this had become. The dispatcher was still waiting on his radio for updates, but he ignored it completely. Across the street, more residents had gathered outside. Some stood in robes holding coffee cups, while others pretended to check their mail just to get closer to the drama. Phones were out now, too. Cedar Ridge loved recording things almost as much as it loved gossiping about them later. Deborah noticed the attention immediately and straightened her posture like she was stepping onto a stage. This neighborhood has rules for a reason, she announced loudly enough for everybody to hear. We cannot allow people to bring unsafe or unauthorized activity into this community. I leaned lightly against the Jeep and crossed my arms. Unsafe activity, I repeated calmly. That is what we are calling a parked vehicle now. Do not play games with me, Ethan. She pointed toward the Jeep again. Nobody knows what is inside that thing. The funny part was that she actually believed she sounded reasonable. Fear does strange things to people once they get addicted to authority. They start convincing themselves they are protecting others, when really they are just protecting control. Frank's phone suddenly buzzed in his hand. He looked down, answered immediately, then walked several feet away before speaking in a low voice. I watched his face carefully as he listened. Whatever he heard made him glance back toward the Jeep 3 separate times. Deborah noticed too. What now? She demanded. Frank lowered the phone slowly after the call ended. My supervisor is on the way. Good, Deborah snapped. Maybe he can explain why your company suddenly forgot how to enforce a tow order. Frank hesitated before speaking. Ma'am, he said quietly. He is not coming because of the tow order. That finally made her pause. Not long, just enough to notice something felt different. Then the distant sound of tires rolling across asphalt echoed from the front entrance of the neighborhood. Every head on the street turned in the same direction. A black SUV entered Cedar Ridge without stopping at the security gate. Another followed directly behind it. No flashing lights. No sirens. Just 2 dark vehicles moving slowly and deliberately through the perfectly clean suburban streets like they belonged there more than anybody else. Frank stepped backward immediately. Deborah frowned in confusion. But the second I saw the small antenna mounted near the rear window of the first SUV, I checked my watch and quietly exhaled. They had arrived faster than I expected. The 2 black SUVs rolled silently down the center of the street like they had all the time in the world. No emergency lights. No markings on the doors. Just dark, tinted windows reflecting the sunrise across perfectly trimmed lawns and decorative stone mailboxes. The entire neighborhood watched in complete silence as both vehicles stopped directly in front of my driveway. Even Deborah stopped talking. The engines shut off almost simultaneously. Then the driver's side doors opened. 3 people stepped out wearing dark windbreakers, plain khaki pants, and the kind of calm expression you only see on people who never need to raise their voices to be taken seriously. No wasted movement. No confusion. Just quiet certainty. Frank immediately stepped away from the Jeep and lowered his eyes like he suddenly realized he had wandered into somebody else's jurisdiction. The tallest of the 3 agents walked toward the driveway holding a thin tablet in one hand. He looked at the Jeep first, then at the chain lying loose on the concrete, then finally at me. Mr. Cole, he said evenly. Morning. Morning, I answered. Deborah blinked twice. Her entire posture changed the second she realized these people knew my name before asking for it. But she recovered quickly because people like Deborah always mistake confidence for immunity. Excuse me, she interrupted sharply, stepping forward with her clipboard still tucked against her side. Who exactly are you people? The agent turned toward her slowly. Who authorized the attempted seizure of that vehicle? He asked instead of answering. His tone stayed perfectly calm, which somehow made the question feel heavier. Deborah straightened immediately. I did. Deborah Whitmore, president of the Copper Ridge Homeowners Association. She emphasized every word like she expected it to matter. The agent looked down briefly at the clipboard in her hand. Did you personally sign the tow authorization? Yes, she answered. That vehicle has multiple violations under community code. The second agent moved toward the Jeep and checked the VIN plate through the windshield. He nodded once toward the others. That tiny movement changed the atmosphere instantly. It was subtle, but everybody felt it. The neighbors stopped whispering. Frank took another step backward. Even the birds seemed quieter for a moment. Deborah looked around, clearly sensing the shift, but not understanding it. This is a private residential community, she continued defensively. We have every legal right to enforce our regulations. The taller agent finally looked directly at her again. Ma'am, he said calmly, federal jurisdiction does not stop at your landscaping entrance. The entire cul-de-sac froze. You could actually hear somebody across the street lower their coffee mug onto concrete. Deborah stared at him for a second, like her brain rejected the sentence completely. Federal, she repeated. What are you talking about? The third agent stepped closer, holding a printed sheet of paper that had clearly been rushed from a vehicle printer moments earlier. This vehicle is attached to an active federal asset registry, he explained. Any unauthorized towing, impound, or interference automatically triggers a security response. Deborah laughed once, not because she thought it was funny, because people laugh when panic starts mixing with disbelief. That is absurd, she said. It is a Jeep. Correct, the agent replied. And your tow operator initiated a restricted movement alert at 0522 this morning. Frank quietly removed his company hat and held it against his chest. Deborah turned toward me slowly now, and for the first time since this entire thing started, the confidence in her face cracked. Just a little. You knew this would happen, she said quietly. I looked at the loose chain on the driveway, then back at her. I warned you more than once. Deborah's grip tightened around her clipboard so hard I thought the plastic might crack in half. The confidence that had carried her through the entire morning was fading now, replaced by the kind of panic people try desperately to hide in front of an audience. But the audience was still there. Half the neighborhood stood outside pretending not to stare while openly staring at everything. Phones remained raised. Coffee cups forgotten. Even the sprinklers had shut off by now, leaving the street strangely quiet except for the soft ticking sound of the tow truck engine cooling down. The taller agent turned his tablet around and showed Frank something on the screen. Frank nodded immediately. Understood, he said quickly. The vehicle was never moved beyond initial hookup. Good, the agent replied. Then he looked toward the loose chain still lying across my driveway. Document everything before removal. Another agent began taking photographs of the Jeep, the tow truck, the chain placement, and Deborah's signed paperwork still clipped to her board. That was the moment she finally realized this situation was not disappearing quietly. Wait a second, she said sharply. You cannot just come into a private neighborhood and start photographing residents. The agent did not even look up from the paperwork. We are documenting an unauthorized interference event involving protected federal property. Deborah blinked rapidly. Protected? She repeated. This is insane. No, ma'am, the agent answered calmly. What is insane is authorizing a seizure order without verifying ownership classification. One of the neighbors quietly muttered, "Oh my God," under his breath. Deborah heard it and immediately turned defensive again. Nobody told us any of this, she snapped while pointing toward me. He intentionally concealed whatever this is. I almost smiled at the word concealed. The Jeep had been parked in plain sight every single day. She just never imagined there were systems in this country bigger than her HOA handbook. The taller agent finally addressed her directly again. Did you receive prior verbal warning before authorizing the tow? Deborah hesitated. Just for a second. That is irrelevant. Actually, he replied evenly. It is extremely relevant. He tapped something on the tablet screen. Tow dispatch recordings confirm Mr. Cole advised both you and the operator to stop before movement escalation occurred. Frank lowered his head immediately after hearing that. He knew exactly what recordings they meant. Tow companies record nearly everything now for liability reasons. Deborah suddenly looked smaller standing there in the middle of the driveway. Still angry. still trying to fight for control, but smaller. I was enforcing community policy, she insisted. The vehicle looked suspicious. The second agent glanced toward the Jeep. It looked dusty. A few people nearby accidentally laughed before immediately going quiet again. Deborah's face turned bright red. The taller agent continued reviewing the paperwork while speaking in the same calm tone. Your authorization form lists the vehicle as abandoned. It was parked there for days at a time, in the owner's driveway. Deborah opened her mouth, but nothing came out immediately. The silence stretched awkwardly across the street. Then the agent held up another sheet from the clipboard. Interesting, he said. You also marked the vehicle as potentially hazardous. Deborah crossed her arms defensively. I had concerns. Based on what? She asked. The modifications. The markings. The behavior. The agent slowly lowered the paperwork. Behavior. Deborah pointed toward me again. Nobody in this neighborhood knows who he really is. For the first time all morning, the agent looked directly at me for several seconds before answering her. That, he said calmly, was very much the point. The entire street went silent again after that sentence. And somewhere behind the black, tinted windows of the second SUV, I heard a printer start running. The small printer inside the SUV kept running for several seconds, feeding out page after page while the entire neighborhood stood frozen in silence. It sounded strangely loud in the middle of the quiet suburban street. Deborah watched the agents carefully now, no longer speaking with the same confidence she had 20 minutes earlier. The clipboard in her hands had lowered almost to her side. One of the agents walked back from the SUV carrying a thin stack of freshly printed documents. He handed them directly to the taller agent, who flipped through the pages calmly while morning sunlight reflected across the black hood of my Jeep. Frank stayed near the tow truck without moving, like a man waiting to find out how expensive his morning was about to become. The taller agent stopped on one page and looked toward Deborah again. Interesting, he said evenly. According to these records, this is not your first unauthorized enforcement complaint. Deborah's face tightened immediately. I have no idea what you were talking about. 3 residents filed disputes last year regarding selective towing threats and improper fines. Several neighbors exchanged uncomfortable looks after hearing that. One woman near the corner slowly lowered her phone. Another neighbor muttered, I told you she was doing that. Deborah heard him instantly. Excuse me, she snapped. You all asked me to maintain standards in this neighborhood. Nobody answered her this time. That seemed to hit harder than any argument could have. The agent continued flipping through paperwork. There are also multiple citations issued under categories that do not appear in your own HOA bylaws. Deborah crossed her arms defensively. Again, I expanded enforcement language under board discretion. Without legal review? The agent asked. She hesitated again. Tiny pauses like that reveal everything. Across the street, more phones appeared. But now nobody was filming me. They were filming her. Deborah finally noticed it too. The same audience she had tried to rally against me had quietly shifted directions without saying a word. Fear changes sides very quickly when authority enters the picture. This is harassment, she said sharply. You people cannot intimidate private citizens. The taller agent calmly handed one page back toward her. Ma'am, your signature authorized the removal of federally registered operational equipment based on fabricated hazard claims. Her eyes widened slightly as she scanned the document. Fabricated, she repeated. I had legitimate concerns. You listed the vehicle as abandoned while it was parked in the registered custodian's driveway. Silence again. One of the neighbors actually laughed under his breath before pretending to cough into his coffee cup. Deborah looked around the street desperately now, searching for support that was no longer there. But the mood had changed completely. People who spent months nodding along with her complaints were suddenly remembering every strange fine, every warning letter, every petty violation notice she had ever issued. The second agent stepped toward the tow truck and removed the final chain from beneath the Jeep. Metal scraped softly across the concrete before he carried it away from the vehicle completely. Then he placed a bright orange evidence tag around one of the hooks. Frank looked like he might pass out. Tow operator cooperation has been noted, the taller agent said without even looking at him. Frank nodded so fast it almost looked painful. Deborah stared at the evidence tag like her brain could not process what she was seeing. Evidence, she whispered. The agent slid the paperwork back into his folder. Your live stream recording, dispatch audio, signed authorization forms, and vehicle interference timeline have all been archived. That sentence landed like a brick in the middle of the street. Deborah's own live stream. The same video she proudly started earlier to publicly humiliate me had just become the cleanest documentation package anybody could ask for. And judging by the expression on her face, she finally understood that too late. By 8:30 that morning, the black SUVs were gone. The agents left as quietly as they arrived, taking the tag chain, copies of the paperwork, and every ounce of confidence Deborah Whitmore had left. The tow truck disappeared 10 minutes later after Frank personally apologized to me 3 separate times before driving out of Copper Ridge with both hands gripping the wheel like he had just survived a natural disaster. But the real damage did not happen on my driveway. It happened afterward. Neighborhoods like Copper Ridge survive on appearances. Perfect lawns, perfect fences, perfect smiles during HOA meetings. The second those appearances crack, everybody suddenly starts remembering things they ignored before. By lunchtime, Deborah's live stream had spread through the community Facebook group. At first, people shared it because they thought it was entertaining. Then somebody clipped the moment the agents mentioned fabricated reports. Somebody else uploaded screenshots of old violation notices they had received from Deborah over the years. Within hours, the comments turned against her completely. Residents started comparing fines, towing threats, warning letters, selective enforcement. One couple revealed she fined them because their American flag was too faded. Another family posted emails where she threatened legal action over chalk drawings on a driveway. The floodgates opened all at once. I spent most of the afternoon inside my garage wiping desert dust off the Jeep with an old microfiber towel while the neighborhood unraveled outside. The chain marks beneath the front bumper were still visible where Frank had hooked the tow rig. Thin scratches across the steel coating. Small. Permanent. Strange how little scars become reminders. Around sunset, somebody knocked softly on my open garage frame. It was the retired dentist from across the street. Gary. He looked uncomfortable standing there holding a 6-pack of root beer like a peace offering. Figured I owed you an apology, he said awkwardly. Most of us thought Deborah was exaggerating, but, well, he glanced toward the Jeep carefully. We also thought maybe there was something strange going on. I laughed quietly. There was. He smiled nervously, but did not ask questions. Smart man. Emergency HOA meeting tonight, he said instead. Half the board already resigned. I nodded once and went back to wiping dust from the hood. By the next morning, Deborah's name had vanished from the neighborhood announcement board near the entrance gate. Temporary Administration Committee pending review. That was the official wording. But everybody knew what really happened. She lost the only thing people like her ever truly care about. Control. Over the next few weeks, things in Copper Ridge became strangely peaceful. No more warning letters taped to doors. No more measuring grass height with rulers. No more angry emails about mailbox colors. Funny how quickly communities calm down once the loudest person loses the microphone. As for me, I kept doing exactly what I had always done. Quiet mornings, late nights, long drives through the desert outside Tucson whenever work required it. The Jeep stayed parked in the same driveway every night beneath the same porch light that had illuminated the tow chains that morning. Only now, nobody complained about it anymore. In fact, most neighbors avoided even looking directly at it. A month later, I found the faded windshield decal reflected in the garage light while I was changing the oil. Tiny blue lettering. Barely noticeable unless you knew what it meant. Deborah spent months obsessing over that sticker because she thought power looked obvious. Loud voices. Threats. Clipboards. Rules. But real authority does not need to announce itself to anybody. It just waits quietly until somebody foolish enough decides to test it.